This morning, we are in week 3 of a series that we have been working through on doubt. And if this is your first time with us, I just want to quickly kind of catch you up to speed, just so you know kind of where we've come as a kind of a foundation to where we're going today. 2 weeks ago, we kind of introduced this idea and normalized this idea that doubt is kind of a normal part of the Christian experience, that not all of us have it all together, not all of us have every sort of question or wrestling completely resolved, and that it's okay that we are people in process. Last week, we talked about this reality or these seasons in our life where it feels like maybe God is silent, where God is not speaking, or we're not able to hear God in the way that we're kind of looking and longing to hear God, and how those, if we don't process them in a healthy way, that can be a seed of doubt that shows up in our lives. But this morning, as we continue, we're going to kind of talk about the doubt that comes from disappointment. The doubt that sort of can lead to a word that gets used a lot, at least in Christian and faith circles, doubt that can lead to deconstruction. And I'm not going to say a lot about that right at the get-go. We're going to come back to talking about that a little bit later this morning. But we can all probably relate. Again, those of us who are followers of Jesus, we can relate to what it feels like to have disappointment in our faith. Maybe the disappointment comes from a prayer that you prayed with everything that you had in you, and the answer you hoped for never came. Maybe the disappointment is from a version of God that you were taught, a version of God that you grew up with, one who promises certain things, but yet you look at your life and you're wondering, well, where's the promises that I thought came with this Christian life? I was told that life would work out, and it would work out in a great way, but yet it doesn't seem like life is cooperated. Maybe some of that disappointment, that it comes from a season of life of struggling, a season of life of wrestling, where you begin to pull apart the things that you grew up believing to be true, where you begin to sort of assess what actually holds weight and what doesn't. Is this really what the Bible actually says, or is it sort of the Bible dressed up in a costume that has become a part of your life that you just were told this is what it means to be a follower of Jesus? If you've ever experienced disappointment in your faith, if you've ever wrestled with it, if you found yourself in that season of deconstruction, here's what I want you to know. I want us all to understand that doubt can lock us up, right? Like doubt has a way of locking us up as people, but it doesn't have to lock you out. Doubt has a way of maybe pausing and causing us to wrestle, but that wrestling doesn't have to or doesn't mean the end of your faith. And I want to take you to a story about a guy named John the Baptist. And I think John understood this tension better than most people in Scripture. If you don't know anything about John, let me just kind of say it this way. John wasn't the hedge your bets kind of guy, right? Like John he didn't weigh two options. John went in. What John believed, what John was passionate for, John went after. And he was kind of a wild child, right? Like the Bible tells us that he was a man who was living in the wilderness. He was eating locusts. How many of you guys had locusts for dinner last night? It's a delicatessen. Anyways, right? Like, yeah, you got it. I'm English bad. He would eat locusts. He would eat wild honey. He would wear camel hair. Nothing like the fine camel hair, jacket to put on. Like he was going around in the wilderness of ancient Israel, preaching and declaring the coming kingdom of God in a way that made the religious leaders of his day a little nervous. He was preaching in anticipation of Jesus who was to come. And then one day, they have the moment where they meet. John is at the Jordan River, and Jesus shows up. And when he shows up, this is what John says. John notices him as Jesus walks into the scene right away. And this is where we pick up in John chapter 1, verse 29. The next day, John saw Jesus coming towards him and said, "Look, look, the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world." Right? As soon as John notices Jesus, he sort of declares who he is. This isn't a tentative endorsement about who Jesus is. He's staking his entire ministry on this one claim. This guy who just walked into this scene, he is the one. He's the Messiah. He's the one we have been waiting for. Like he, again, not a hedge your bets kind of guy. This is the one. Now we fast forward, a few years from that scene, and John's circumstances have changed a little bit. John isn't in the Jordan River Valley. John is actually himself in prison. He's locked up. He's locked up for what he has been claiming. He's locked up for the movement that he is a part of. And as he sits in prison, John gets this idea that he's going to send his disciples, just his followers, the guys who've been learning from John as John learns the way of Jesus. He sends his disciples to go find Jesus and ask Jesus a question. It's not a small question. Now, I just want to maybe pause here a second to give us a little context to the question that's going to be asked. John is incredibly adept at the Old Testament scriptures. John would be well aware of the Old Testament prophecies that pointed to the Messiah's arrival. It's the reason why he could see Jesus and say, "That's the one. This is the one that we've been waiting for." He knows Isaiah 61, which paints this picture of the Messiah who's coming to give freedom to prisoners. He gets all that. But in this moment, he is sitting in a literal cell, imprisoned, waiting on the Messiah that he himself announced. And in this moment, it seems like there's no movement. Nothing is happening. Nothing about his own chains is changing. And if you ever need a compelling case for what disappointment and doubt might look like in this moment, I mean, this is about as clear as it gets. Which is why he sent his disciples to Jesus. And this is the question his disciples ask Jesus. We find this in Matthew chapter 11, beginning in verse 2. Again, John the Baptist, who was in prison, heard about all the things the Messiah was doing, so he sent his disciples to ask Jesus, "Are you the Messiah that we have been expecting? Or should we keep looking for someone else?" Just think about what shifted in John in just a few years. Again, that is the Messiah. This is the one that we've been waiting for 3 years later. Are you the Messiah? Are you the one? Right? Like this is the guy who had the privilege of baptizing Jesus in the Jordan River. The guy who got to experience an encounter with him. He's wondering in this moment, was I right back then? Or did I get it all wrong? Are you the Messiah or are you not? Again, this is the kind of doubt that comes from someone who staked everything on a claim and is now watching his life end in a way that doesn't match what he expected the Messiah to do, what he expected this movement of Jesus to look like. You see, John expected liberation. Not just liberation for him, but liberation for all. He expected to be somewhere other than in chains, in prison for his faith. This gap between what John expected and what he was actually experiencing, this gap is a gap that many of us can relate to. Sort of the gap that we can experience in our own lives. God, this is what I thought you were going to do, but this is where I am. God, this is what I believe to be true about what your word says, but this is the reality of my life. This is where John's question comes from. This is what disappointment-driven doubt looks like. This is, I trusted you. I built my life on this, and it isn't going away the way I thought it would. For all of us, these are the kind of moments that lead to questions. These are the kind of moments that lead to wrestling. These are the kind of moments that can lead to deconstruction. And I mentioned we'd come back to that. And I wanted to spend a moment talking about it because at least in church circles, at least among Christians in this moment, it's a word that seemingly is gaining traction as more and more people are talking about a deconstruction of their faith. And that can make us nervous, especially if it's someone we care about. Especially if it's someone that we love deeply. And part of the reason why we get so nervous about it is because we've kind of tied deconstruction and made it synonymous with losing your faith, right? And so someone, when they say, I'm deconstructing my faith, what many of us hear is, I'm losing my faith, which might actually not be the case. It's not really sort of what we see from a data standpoint, which we'll get to in just a moment, to be true. But just to make sure we all understand what it is that I'm talking about when I say deconstruction, here's sort of a working definition for us today. Deconstruction is examining what you were taught and figuring out what actually holds weight. Deconstruction is examining what you were taught and figuring out what exactly holds weight. Here's the truth. Not everything that you and I were taught growing up is right, and not everything that we were taught growing up was wrong. It's not one or the other. And sometimes what gets called losing your faith is actually the tearing down of a faith that was never sturdy to begin with, so that something can be built that's stronger on a better foundation, on the true foundation of Jesus that is put in its place. Which is why deconstruction is not the same as walking away. Even though at times those two can look eerily similar. The two can almost look identical. A few years ago, the Barna Research Group, which may mean something to you, probably not to a lot of you, they are a faith-based sort of think tank. They do a lot of research on things that pertain to church, to faith, to Christianity, and they did this sort of exhaustive, intensive study on deconstruction among Christians today. And what they found was actually more encouraging than I think a lot of us think it can be when we start hearing that word. What they found was that those who had gone through the process of deconstructing their faith were just as likely to engage in the things of faith as those who never went through the process to begin with. So let me say this a little differently. Whether you've deconstructed or not, those who have and those who haven't are just as likely to still engage and be a part of faith and the church and the faith community. There's no difference between whether one deconstructs or not, right? Which should be encouraging. which means that a lot of those, maybe some of you here have gone through or going through a season of deconstruction. It means that you're likely going to still be in the church. You're still going to hold faith in Jesus, which is a surprise. It's a surprise because when it comes to deconstruction, a lot of what we hear are the loudest stories. Or we feel the maybe outcome from those who are closest to us and the pain of a process that didn't end up with them still believing in Jesus. We seem to bank it all on what we know, which is part of the human experience, and what we hear, which is the other part of the human experience, and we think, well, this is it. If a person goes through the process of deconstruction, they are going to lose their faith. And the encouraging thing I would say is that is not actually true. And if you are in this season where you're wrestling and you've got some disappointments that have kind of led into some doubt, and that doubt is starting to look a lot like deconstruction, and maybe there's a worry in you like, oh my gosh, is this going to mean my faith is going to fall apart? It's not in and of itself what it means. But so much of that depends on us. So much of it depends on how we engage in the process, how we handle disappointment, how we handle deconstruction. Now, the story of John gives us no sort of inkling that John is going through deconstruction. I'm not saying that John is in a season of deconstructing his faith, but we know that there's inherently some disappointment. What I want us to take note of is how John walks through this and how Jesus meets John in this tender moment. You see, John's disciples, again, they go to Jesus, they ask this question, are you the one? John's back in prison. John wants to make sure that you are the Messiah. And Jesus responds in verse 4 and 5. Jesus told them, go back to John and tell him what you have heard and seen. The blind see, the lame walk, those with leprosy are cured, the deaf hear, and the dead are raised to life. The good news is being preached to the poor. Jesus answers John's question with evidence. He answers John's question with gentleness. He answers John's question in a way that still allows John to draw his own conclusion. But then at the end of verse 4 and 5 comes verse 6, and there Jesus offers one last statement that is easy for us to miss, or if not miss, it's easy for us to misunderstand. What I want us to see as we get to this is one of the most tender moments in the gospel account. Jesus says these words in verse 6, and he added, God blesses those who do not fall away because of me. Again, on the surface, it feels like it's a bit of an odd statement for Jesus. So I think we need to really sit with that for a moment. The phrase that is used there, sort of fall away, if you trace it back to the original language of the New Testament, which is Greek, the root word there is the same root word that is used for the English word today, scandal. Holds maybe a little different meaning than maybe just the phrase fall away. And what Jesus is getting at here is he's getting at this idea like, it doesn't mean that those who trip up just a little bit because of me, or those who get confused because of me, that's not what he's talking about. It carries a sense of being caught up by something that could potentially cause you to fall away entirely. In this moment, Jesus, in his response, is naming what's actually at stake for John as he sits in his prison cell. And when he names this, I want to be clear, this is not a rebuke by Jesus, it is an acknowledgement. Jesus is acknowledging how hard this is for John. He's essentially saying, John, I understand. I understand how hard this is for you, watching what your expectations were collide with the reality that you find yourself in. It's not a shame on you for asking. It's more of I know how hard this is to reconcile. And if you find yourself in that gap between what you expected and what life is, I think when Jesus, as we approach him with our questions, as we approach him with our doubt, I think in these spaces, Jesus is kind of very compassionately saying to us, I know how hard this can be to reconcile. But I want you to know that I'm not going anywhere. I'm not running away. I'm not casting you away because you had the audacity to ask me a question. You should just accept and believe. That's not what Jesus is saying. The blessing that Jesus is offering in these difficult moments, in these moments that could just take us down, that could take our faith down, is he's offering us his presence. You see, that's the blessing he talked about. The blessing to John is the same blessing to us, that he will be with us, that he walks beside us, even in the disappointing moments and seasons of our lives. You see, the real danger for John was never the questioning. The danger for John would have been staying silent in the cell, wrestling with his disappointment and doubt on his own, never sending it anywhere, allowing it to calcify in his heart and to become something worse than the actual doubt. John chooses a different way. John puts it out into the open. John takes his disappointment and he puts it before Jesus. And that's the pattern that I want us to see. Because this isn't just John's struggle. We've kind of already named it. This is a reality for each and every one of us as well. You see, disappointment isn't what makes people usually walk away from God. The disappointment overnight isn't what makes people walk away. It's usually a slower process than that. What can often happen is someone gets disappointed because God doesn't show up the way that they expect God to show up. And instead of saying it out loud, they choose to go quiet. Maybe they keep showing up. Maybe they keep coming to church, but quietly they've stopped participating. Quietly they've stopped seeking. The question doesn't get answered. The disappointment doesn't get addressed. It just sits there in the dark, and it picks up weight. And in that way, it becomes our own prison cell. John was in a literal prison. We at times put ourselves in an emotional and mental prison. And we're there not because of the doubt. We're there because of the isolation that we've put ourselves in. So I want you to hear this. If you are disappointed with God right now, that disappointment is not the dangerous part. The dangerous part is carrying that disappointment alone. Doubt that stays private doesn't stay small. The doubt that we have that stays private, it only grows and becomes bigger and bigger like a nasty weed. This is not in my notes, so I don't know where this is going to go here, but I have a lilac bush in my yard. No, not nice. That thing grows everywhere. Like, it's got roots that, like, yesterday, like, I come in, I'm, like, dripping sweat, like, dirt on my face. My wife's like, what are you doing? Like, I'm trying to get this lilac bush out of the yard. Like, I'm trying to bring what has been festering in the darkness up to light. Right? Like, but just every analogy breaks down at some point, so just roll with me. But, like, that's doubt. Right? If we don't bring the doubt to the surface, it doesn't stay small. These little tentacles that just root in unhealthy ways. And they show up in unhealthy ways. And that's not what we're meant to live with. It's not how we're expected to walk through this life. And so I want to offer sort of an alternative this week. And if you were here week 1, what I'm going to offer is going to look very similar to what we talked about in week 1. Right? Like week 1 was about naming our doubt. Well, this week is the opportunity to name the disappointment, and they're different. The doubt is maybe, these are what I'm really wrestling with when it comes to my faith right now, but the disappointment, if left unaddressed, will become doubt. So we name the doubt and we name the disappointment. We name the prayers that went unanswered. We name the version of God that feels different than what we were promised. We name the moments, if we have them, that the church let us down and never acknowledged it did so. We name them. We name them verbally. For some of us, maybe we need to name them by writing them down. Last week, one of the things I encouraged each and every one of us to do is to be intentional about journaling, about putting down what it is that we're praying, because sometimes the issue isn't that God has not answered our prayers, is we've lost perspective of how God has moved through this season of prayer. And so maybe what the encouragement today is, or this week, is to take that journal that you got last week and begin to name your disappointment, to write it down. And if you weren't here last week and you didn't grab a journal, what I want you to know is we'll have them this week as well. When you head out at each of our first-time guest tents, you can just stop by, say, I need a journal, and they'll say, are you a first-timer? Well, either way, they're going to give you a journal, but they'll probably give you more if you say that you're a first-timer. Hint, there's a gift, so just say it. Mike's unhinged today. Yay. So write it down. Name the disappointment. And then here's probably the more difficult step, is to take that disappointment to someone else. To take that disappointment to someone you trust, to bring it to them, not to be talked out of it, not so that you can be fixed or reassured that everything is fine. We're just bringing it to someone else so that they know, so that we're bringing the struggle, we're bringing our doubt and disappointment into the light. But I want to take a second to also talk to those of us who are on the receiving end of maybe one of those conversations this week. Like someone in your life might get to the place where they're not only brave enough to declare their disappointment to God, but they're brave enough to bring their disappointment to us. And so how do we steward that information well? And so let me just say this at the get-go. You don't need to fix it. You don't need to answer the why in that moment. You don't need to tell them maybe why God did or did not answer their prayers like they hoped he would in those moments. You don't need to fix it. You don't need to give answers to it. Resist just throwing Bible verses at someone when they bring this to you. Not that those verses aren't true, but if given in the first 5 minutes of the conversation, they feel a lot like stop dealing with this, dressed up as scripture. If someone is tender enough to bring you their disappointment, don't just shut it down. And at the same time, don't just be alarmed, right? Like if someone comes to you and says, hey, I think I'm going through a season of my faith where I'm starting to deconstruct what I've believed to be true. Like don't treat those words like they've just told you that they're on fire, because they're not. They're in a process. They're in a season. And so instead of just giving answers and Bible verses, at least at the very beginning, ask questions. Ask them, what happened? What is it that you need from me right now? Do you need someone to just listen? Do you need someone to help think you through this wrestling? You can all relate to this. There's nothing more frustrated than when someone gives you an answer when you just wanted them to listen, or when someone is listening when you want them to give you an answer. It's frustrating. And so don't guess. Just ask. What do you want from me right now? Do you want me to listen? Do you want me to help you think through this? Be willing to sit in the discomfort instead of rushing to resolve the situation. Which is exactly how Jesus handled John's question. No rebuke, no panic, no rush to make sure he gets the right answer. Instead, he just simply offers his presence. He gives him evidence. He gives grace. And that order matters. Presence, evidence, grace. And if this is the model that God chose to use with John, then by all means, it is a model that should be good enough for us as people approach us in our lives with their own disappointment and deconstruction. Lastly, if someone comes to you this week, again, first off, just realize how fortunate you are that they are trusting you with this precious information. And so if someone comes to you this week and you just listen, you ask great questions, here's the encouragement that I would say. Follow up with them a few days later. Send a text message. Check in on them. I promise you, what you say in that text, the encouragement that you share in that text message a few days later would be more impactful to them than almost anything you can say in that moment. The text shows that you care. The text shows that you're engaged, that you're for them, and that you're walking through this season with them. Here's the hard part about John's story, at least as we know of it. He never got a tidy resolution. He didn't live to see Jesus finish his ministry. John's story didn't end with liberation or vindication or even a happy ending. I don't want to hide that from you because it tells us something about following Jesus. You see, following Jesus was never about getting all your questions resolved, at least not on this side of eternity. It's about putting those questions. It's about putting our life in the rightful place, in the hands of who it belongs. And so if you find yourself in a season with real disappointment right now, the kind that makes you quietly want to pull away, to deconstruct in private, to disappear maybe from this room and not tell anyone, I want to say to you, I want to say to us that this passage is reminding us that our questions, that your questions don't disqualify you, but the silence around them will isolate you. Doubt can lock you up, but it doesn't have to lock you out. Don't allow yourself to get locked up. Don't allow yourself to stay in secret. Bring to life what needs to be brought to light. Find a person, a trusted person where you can say the actual thing, the very thing that you boldly told Jesus to be true about where your disappointment lies. And I promise you, those 2 steps will be your first steps out of prison and into freedom. Would you pray with me?